I've joined this meeting at 12 noon. I hope you guys don't get too hungry. I'd like to start off with just a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, my name is Peter Siegel, and in terms of the housekeeping, we'd like you to keep yourself muted and your webcam off. And if you have questions during this webinar, we'd like you to email them to Allison Watson at aaw@digitaltransitions.com. And if time allows, we will address these questions at the end. And we like to do this because it's just easier to have a flow through the presentation. If you'd like to submit questions more in an offline manner or after the webinar, if you're in the U.S., please contact us via info@dtdch.com or your cultural heritage salesperson. If you're international today, please contact your Phase 1 cultural heritage dealer outside the U.S. If you do not have one, please use the info email at dtdch.com. Okay, so I'll give a little agenda today. I'm going to give a little bit of a quick overview about our Division of Cultural Heritage and our educational or professional development offerings. And Doug Peterson, who is our product manager for our cultural heritage equipment and solutions, will give us an in-depth conversation about what process control is, discuss the sources of variability, and methods of monitoring process control. So let's go on to the next slide. Our Division of Cultural Heritage was brought about years ago, and this presentation is very appropriate for our solutions because we make purpose-built solutions for digitization of holdings which follow process control very tightly. So our hardware and software is all designed for the accuracy and precise capture of classic cultural heritage items such as books, loose materials, works of art, photographic films, and scientific specimens, and so forth. We are offering what we call a large professional development offering, and it's basically built on a building block, and I'll get more into this as we talk about this some more. So in the past, we've offered webinars on Capture One CH, webinars on using instant capture cameras like the digital backs to digitize film instead of film scanning. We also held a course at the IS&T conference on Apple scripting to enhance your workflow. Today, we're offering a webinar on process control, digitizing by the rules. And the reason why this falls in line with our larger plans is that we want to start off with a building block. And basically, if you understand process control, you will have a lot more foundation to build upon when you have more complicated problems to implement and photographing non-normalized collections. So for instance, what's going to come up next is creative imaging, when to break those rules. Because sometimes you have collections which we call outliers. Sometimes they're called the problem children in your collection, and these require either descriptive lighting or raking type light or point of view lighting, and also relative to more complexity is how to digitize and interpret photographic negative film to make a very good-looking positive. Also coming up, aside from breaking the rules, we're doing a roundtable later this month at the Morgan Library, which is going to have a focus on multispectral imaging. And that focus is going to be about revealing hidden information within our cultural heritage objects and also hyper-accurate color. Also, as part of this roundtable at the Morgan, we're going to have a discussion on film scanning and how to get the most out of your digital cameras to digitize film. Further on this quarter, we're going to do specialized training called Phase 1 Cultural Heritage Specialist Training, with a deep focus on the camera technology and support-related issues. And another thing that's extremely exciting for us is that after over a year of writing and editing and contributions from 25 institutions, we're going to make available online a digitization program planning guide. So all this is all pretty exciting stuff. So next year, we are going to do a short course, again for IS&T in Washington, D.C. On autocropping. We're going to get into discussions about advanced algorithms and how to optimize workflows based on autocrop tools. And also, we're going to announce a digitization academy. And this webinar today is loosely tied to that. Again, it's designed as a core curriculum up to advanced topics. So keep your eyes out for that as well. So let's see, in the future, obviously, we really, to make these webinars and events that we do at conferences and other institutions most effective, we would love to hear from you folks because we can't live in a vacuum. So your input is always greatly appreciated. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Doug Peterson, who's going to run our process control webinar today.
All right, so today's conversation is going to center around process control. And I hate to do this in any presentation, but I am going to bore you with the dictionary definition of process control because it is something that's a little bit foreign to most people in a digitization or library or museum setting. Process control actually comes from the engineering and technical world, and it is a philosophy and a set of principles and a set of guidelines, a set of way of doing things to help ensure accurate and precise output by monitoring and controlling variability during the input. And looking at this photo here, I think is a good sort of shorthand for the types of industries and the types of applications whence the process control mentality came. When you have systems that have lots of variables, especially if those variables interact with each other, it is absolutely required to get a firm grasp on how and where variation is coming into play, how to monitor that variation, how to control that variation. So although we are very much the philosophy that digitization is much more than simply making a widget, that this is a field that requires both science and art, that today's webinar is going to be focusing on the science part, and from that point of view, looking at some of the tenets of process control can be very illuminative to how we can successfully execute a digitization program with high quality output. The first principle of process control is that variation is inevitable. You're never going to get a system with more than one variable to perform identically over and over again. So the only question is how much variation, where is it coming from, and can we set acceptable limits, monitor, and minimize that variation? So what sort of variations do we see? We see variation in accuracy and variation in precision. Now, these sound very similar, and in layman's term, honestly, they're mean more or less interchangeable things when you're talking conversationally. But in this process control terminology, accuracy and precision are related but distinct things. Accuracy is basically what your average is. Precision is how consistent you are. So you can actually be one or the other without necessarily being both. So here on the left, you see the stars on the dartboard there, indicating that generally speaking, you're aiming at the bullseye and you're more or less hitting the bullseye, but only more or less. On the far right, you see precision. That is, all of your darts are hitting in the same spot over and over again, very tightly bundled, very consistent and repeatable, but they're not on the bullseye. So you were repeatable, but wrong. And then finally in the center, of course, if you're both accurate and precise, then you're hitting your mark every time, and you're doing it with a very tight margin, very tight controls. Now, we'll get into a little bit of why later, but in cultural heritage imaging, if we have to choose one, we would rather choose to be precise than accurate. It's much better that your results are all bundled tightly together than to say on average they're right, but they're varying wildly. Now, obviously, to the extent that we can do both, to the extent that we can be accurate and precise, that is by far preferable. So where are the sources of these variations? In cultural heritage imaging, it comes from 5 places. It comes from the hardware, the software, the environment, the standards against which you're measuring, and the user. So we're going to step through some of the components of each of these 5. In hardware, We're not going to bore you by going through every single component, but every single component of the hardware matters. Every single component of the hardware adds up to and provides and increases variability. It is a source of variability. So instead of going through every single one, we're just going to highlight 3 of these. To start off with, let's talk about the shutter aperture and lens quality. The shutter and aperture of most general purpose cameras is not meant for absolute precision and absolute accuracy. It is meant for flexibility in a variety of different circumstances that general photography cameras come into play for. So for example, our shutter in cultural heritage imaging that we use here at DTDCH only maxes out at a 1/60th of a second. That's actually a fairly slow shutter. And at 1/60th of a second, it would make a terrible sports camera. It would make a pretty mediocre wedding camera, but it makes a very good cultural heritage imaging camera or a very good cultural heritage imaging shutter because it is very repeatable in the amount of time that you set it to. If you set it to a 30th of a second, you expect to see a 30th of a second plus or minus a very, very small margin because that's more important to the system design than is whether we can do sports. Same thing with the aperture. The aperture of the lens opens and closes independently from the shutter and determines how much light is being let through. Is part of the determination for how much light gets let through. In a general purpose camera, the aperture opens up in between every shot. So its default is to be open and then it closes down right before the picture is being taken. And this is important because if you're holding a general purpose camera and you want to take a picture of somebody, if you want to shoot at f11, you don't want to have to look through a lens that's stopped down with a small hole in it because there's not a lot of light passing through that. So it's very hard to look through the viewfinder. It's very hard to focus. It's not a useful camera in that general purpose application. But in our cultural heritage aperture, that aperture remains stopped down between frames. Because it's physically not moving between frames, that eliminates, for all intents and purposes, any variation in aperture between frames. Once you set it to f11, it will physically stay that size until you change it to something else. Next is an element of hardware that we wanted to bring up because honestly, we just had an experience with this and it was very fresh in our minds, and it's something that maybe not everyone's aware of. Illumination variation, whether that means that the LED lights you purchased are a little brighter on Tuesday than they were on Monday, whether that means the strobe is putting out a different amount of power, whether it means you're using, for instance, in some specific exterior shots, illumination from natural light, that is just using the sun, and the sun is changing in brightness from clouds passing in front of it. Illumination variation comes into play on every single type of lighting. The only question is, again, how much? And we just recently had an experience where a customer called us up and said, we've been monitoring our results and we're getting more variation than we normally get. In fact, we're getting much more variation than we normally get. Within a sequence of 20 images, the client was receiving plus or minus 5% brightness. That is a huge amount of variation for our equipment and our type of work. So we started helping her troubleshoot, and as we worked through the troubleshooting, we limited everything besides the lighting. And when we asked about the lighting, what we discovered through a series of troubleshooting was that she was using a ProPhoto Acute pack with the bracket turned down. And the ProPhoto Acute pack is a pretty decent pack. It's definitely their entry-level model, but it's suitable for entry-level digitization needs if you keep the bracket at maximum. But in this specific pack, and on a lot of different packs that use analog style bracketing controls, turning the amount of light down using the bracket rather than using the hard switches that control full, half, or a quarter power, using the bracket control actually greatly increases variation of output. So because the client had recently started using -2 on the bracket rather than 1/4 power, they were noticing an increase in variation, and because they were monitoring it, they caught it, and we were able to help them troubleshoot to figure out what it was. This is the darndest little thing, right? This one switch on this power pack throws a wrench into the entire process. But again, if we're monitoring it, if we're aware of the components, then we can identify that and fix that problem or get past that problem very quickly. So again, there's lots of other things in the hardware that can vary. Pretty much every component can contribute to a variation, but we don't want to harp on every single one of them, so let's move on to software. In software, there are a variety of settings and a variety of elements that come into play on accuracy and on precision. And the first one I wanted to point out was tone curve. Every raw processor out there, every photographic software out there assumes that you want to add contrast. And frustratingly, it's not going to say that, generally speaking, in the way that the wording of the program is made. So it won't necessarily say default add contrast. It will just say default amount of contrast, or it will say 0 contrast, or it will say, in the case of Capture One, film standard or auto. But on any of those settings, on any default software settings, what you're going to end up with is the raw data from the camera interpreted with extra contrast added. And the reason is, generally speaking, this is a smart thing to do. If I go out and take pictures of a puppy, then the puppy should have contrast added. If I show you a linear picture of a puppy, you'll think that's kind of dull, it's kind of flat, and it doesn't look like all the other pictures. It doesn't look like the visual vocabulary I have in my head for what a picture of a puppy should look like. It will look very low in contrast. So the default amount of contrast is not 0. And if you do not elect the correct amount of contrast, if you do not elect to use a linear tone curve, you'll still be adding contrast. So doing nothing in this case is actually wrong. You must define a separate non-default setting. In this case, in Capture One, we can actually go to the ... in the top right corner, and we can actually save a new default. So we can overwrite the default. But the default, the universal default, the default that occurs when you install it, is to add contrast, and we don't want that. Here's one that's a little less intuitive. The demosaicing algorithms, or the math in the raw engine, make a big difference to the accuracy and precision of detail as rendered in the final file. There's a mistaken assumption out there that a raw file is just an image in a box ready to be opened up. But in fact, a raw piece of data, a raw image, is nothing like a final image. And constructing that into a final image requires a lot of math. And the quality of that math matters a lot. And we're very proud at DT to be using Capture One, in part because the algorithms in Capture One are so far advanced beyond anyone else's raw converter. And I would like to show you a little close-up of that. Here we are in Capture One CH on the left, and Capture One version 6, which is a legacy version. It was discontinued I don't know, 3 years ago or so. And what we see here is, again, at 400%, so we're magnifying this for it to be easy to see visually. We would normally not inspect images at 400%, but inspecting this at 400%, what we see is a distinct improvement in detail. And I want to emphasize it's the exact same raw file on the left and on the right. The exact same ones and zeros are going into the software, and the software is doing a better job of extracting out that detail. The same exact amount of sharpening is being applied in both images. So this is not a matter of it's simply sharpened more on the left. The underlying detail, the underlying math is better. I'd like to sort of make this analogy between speaking with somebody in a very loud restaurant. You can be sitting with a set of 3 people, and you're talking to both of them at the same time, and they're both equally far away from you, and you're saying the exact same thing, and the background noise is the exact same for both of them, but one person can understand every word you say, and the other person mistakes every other word for something else. Here's another example of that. Here's an intricate, non-repeating detail, non-repeating pattern. What you see is just, again, distinctly more organic, correct, demonstratably more accurate detail coming from the exact same raw data. So, other things that you can look for in sources of variability: destructive editing. If you're using Photoshop or a TIFF editor, or if you're using a camera system or a scanning system that directly scans into a TIFF file, into a final rasterized file, and you're making adjustments to that file, chances are you are doing harm to the file. You are doing what is called destructive editing. It is much preferable to use a system that has the capacity to record the original data as raw and only write out a TIFF once you've decided exactly how to interpret that raw data. That is, how you want to crop it, how you want to make any adjustments to tonality or contrast. Any of those things should be done only as tags assigned to raw data, not done to actual rasterized TIFF data. And Capture One, of course, is a raw editor, and that is the way that we like to work. Same thing with the amount of bit depth. When we're talking about precision, how small of adjustments can you make? What is the bit depth of the camera? What is the bit depth of the software? These things matter when it comes down to fine-tuning things. I've seen a lot of legacy software that couldn't make a change more than 1/3 of a stop because they figured, why would anybody need to be more accurate than that? Well, actually, in our software, we allow 1/100th of a stop changes because in the lab readouts in the target, if you want to match 97.06 and you're at 97.01 and you add 1/3 of a stop, you're now off by 3 or 4 full points instead of being off by a fraction of a point. So next we want to talk about the environment. The environment in which you're imaging can influence the variability of the digitized product. And here we have a kind of a cutesy photo of a train wreck, which is a little bit of a clever, maybe not so clever, I don't know. It's a little bit of a pun reference to the requirement for many digitization facilities 5, 10, 15 years ago to be either away from train tracks or subway tracks or to learn the schedule of the subway or the train nearby, because the amount of vibration they were experiencing was too much for a legacy system like a planetary scanner or a scanning back camera. In those scanning types of hardware, if you're taking 6 seconds or 60 seconds or 6 minutes to make a scan and a train passed by halfway through, then the part of the image that was being scanned when the train came through would be demonstratively less sharp than the area that was being scanned without vibration. So let's take a look at an example of some of the areas of accuracy and precision that can be influenced in modern single-shot capture systems. So here is an image, and we want to ask, what's wrong with this specific image? And as we look at the lab readouts from the chart, from the golden thread object level target, we see that the white value is more or less perfect. It's supposed to be 97.06, it's 97.05. That's essentially perfect. But the black value in patch 21 is meant to be 3.44, and as you see, we're actually getting a much higher value. This is not round off error or acceptable margin. This is a significant deviation from what we wanted to record. So it's being recorded as 10.5 instead of 3.5. What's going wrong? Well, if what we do is blindly follow the target and say, well, the target must be right, what we would normally do is adjust the black point of the image to bring the black point down, such that that 21 patch was around 3.5, which is what we've done on the right. Let's see what we've done to the image by blindly following the target. Here we see with the blind adjustment to make the black patch of the chart correct, we've actually crushed the shadow detail in this painting. And if you had seen this painting, you would know that the shadow detail in here was much, much, much closer to the image on the left than the image on the right. So what was happening? Well, this image was imaged in an environment with brown walls. And that's not desirable, right? We want to be in an environment where we've controlled the ambient environment, we've controlled walls and reflections, the color of the digitizer's outfit, and we've limited those variables so that we don't end up with stray light with wrong color in it. But here's the thing. The object itself is not as glossy as this target is. Sometimes it could be, right? If we were shooting a very glossy object, they could match. But in this specific case, this is a fairly matte finish. And the matte finish of the object is not picking up as much of the gloss of the wall. So where the object level target is actually getting a little bit of contamination, that's sort of a false positive for what's happening in the object. So as we go on today, we'll point out a few more of these areas where blindly following the target is the wrong thing to do. And I think the moral of the story in this particular image is twofold. The first moral is that if you can control your environment, do it. Right? If you can put up a tent in the facility that you're shooting in, if you can put up barriers, if you can paint the walls, if you can have your operator wear something that's dark gray, it doesn't necessarily have to be like black or perfectly monotone, but something that's not super bright reflective red, then that is desirable. Control your environment where you can. But we all know that there are situations, maybe you have to go to a collector's home and shoot something in situ. Maybe you have to go shoot something during a gallery exhibition, that's the only time it's available, and you can't, you're not allowed to, or you don't have enough time to put up walls or curtains or blackboards or V-boards or whatever. So if you can't control the environment, don't assume that the right action is to correct based on the target alone. Because the target, especially those that are glossy, will pick up environmental changes that the object may or may not pick up. So next we want to talk about the standard. What are we measuring against? What are we using as our gold reference point? And in this regard, we want to talk about using the relevant target, selecting the right tone curve, not blindly following the target, and not using dirty targets. So what is a relevant target? Well, there's a lot of legacy targets out there. In fact, in our experience, there are more legacy targets out there than there are modern relevant targets. The targets like you see in the top left here, the Kodak grayscale, the Kodak color control patches, these were developed by Kodak, back when Kodak was a thing, by Kodak for darkroom operation and print control. And the color selection, the type of finish, the features on the target, the variety of colors, the gamut of the colors are not what one would pick out if one was designing a target from scratch for cultural heritage imaging. It's better than nothing, but it's not as good as a modern, relevant CH target. There's also limited targets, that is, targets that are very modern and very solid and very well controlled, like the Color Checker SG. That is an excellent target. However, it's important to recognize that it only has a certain set of features, that is, physical features on it to help you determine what you want to determine about cultural heritage imaging. It's very good for color, and it's very good for tone, but it's not so good at, for instance, sharpness, fall off of sharpness across the frame. It's not exactly designed for illumination uniformity, though you can use the multiple white patches to help approximate that. And it doesn't give you the sort of full set of data that something like the golden thread target gives you. It is very good for color and tone, but not for much else. So what about selecting the right tone curve? And this is something we've got a lot of questions about this last year, and we thought this would be an excellent webinar to sort of sneak in a little mini lesson on linear response versus linear scientific. What's the difference, and why would I want to use one or the other? Linear scientific is unambiguously the more accurate tone curve. And I mean that in a very technical sense. 0 to 0, 255 to 255, straight line in between them. No fall-offs, no change in contrast, no games, no recovery, nothing. Just 0 to 0, 255 to 255. Linear, on the other hand, maintains a fully linear response in the shadows, as you see down here. You don't even see the green dot here. Linear is meant to be green, and blue is linear scientific. Linear green, you don't even see until around this 180 mark, and then they're just very negligibly 1 point different. And they don't really become that different until the 220s, 230s, 240s, where they start to diverge. And the linear curve allows a fall off or a roll off into the highlight. Now, when I've stated that linear scientific is unequivocally the more accurate tone curve, why would I ever want to use linear? Well, as it turns out, for most kinds of cultural heritage imaging, we feel linear is going to be a better option. And if you're going to use linear scientific, you need to be aware of the very brittle nature of the highlights past white. What do I mean by that? This. Here's an example of a non-glossy, perfectly matte surface that is a little bit cuckolded and therefore bending and bowing a little bit into and out of the plane of the light. That is, here on the right side of the object, the cuckolding is placing this material at an angle to the light that's picking up more of a sheen or reflection from the light. So it's brighter because it's pointed at the sort of angle in, angle out, perfect storm location. So the light is coming in, it's bouncing off. It's making that section a little bit brighter than what it would be if it's being receiving light only at a 45-degree angle. So what's happening when that happens is that linear scientific ungracefully fails because linear scientific can't understand anything brighter than white. Whatever we set as white, and in this example we use the golden thread target, patch 10 is determined to be 97 luminance, which means there's 3 points above that target, and once you've hit 100, that's it. Game over. Nothing more. And it's ungracefully or inelegantly failing to render anything whatsoever in this area that's above 255. So the textural detail that's in the normal sort of three-quarter tone there is not taking up anything. It's not showing at all, that texture in this highlight. It's clipped, and it's clipped inelegantly. In contrast, the linear curve, again having that slight roll-off, also engages some recovery mechanisms so that if one particular color channel is clipped, it can make a better guess at what that color would have been, and as a result can reconstruct and aesthetically pleasingly render areas that are, technically speaking, brighter than the white patch of the target. So this is a decision that you have to make as an informed user of the software. Do I want to use linear scientific, which will be more scientifically accurate, or do I want to use linear, which is going to have much more robustness in areas of gloss or areas of reflection, areas of sheen, and things that are not perfectly flat and therefore are picking up the light angle a little bit more than the flat target is. Either option is fine, but depending on what you're targeting, you have to measure against what you've targeted. If you're targeting linear, you have to understand the brightest white is not going to be correct, 100% correct versus its measured value. So in that regard, let me just bring this chart back up. In that regard, it's very important If you choose to use linear, which is our general default recommendation, then make sure you're setting your exposure not based on one of the very bright patches, not based on patch 10 or patch 9, but based on one of the light gray or medium gray target patches. Because if you target it based off of patch 10, then everything will be wrong and patch 10 will be right. Whereas if you target it based off of one of the midtones or one of the light grays, everything will be right except for the very, very bright whites. So the final area of variability, final source of variability, is the user. And this is not to be derogatory towards the user at all. The user, regardless of how intelligent or how well trained or how well-meaning or how hardworking, is always a source of variability. Again, remember at the very beginning, the first slide about this is that there is always variability. We can only measure it, try to minimize it. So even a very good experienced user is going to have variability. Where is that going to happen? It's going to happen because of what we normally call user error, right? Somebody sets a setting wrong or leaves something too close, or they're supposed to set it to 31 and they set it to 32. And so we don't necessarily want to try to dissect every possible user error because basically the user is driving the system. The user could err on anything. Instead, we want to talk and think about and engage with the processes of motivation, eliminating distractions, improving ergonomics, and those sorts of things in order to engage our user the best, in order to make the user, give them the leg up and not put them in a situation where it's easier to make mistakes. So for example, something I've been very fortunate to do is work with a lot of cultural institutions and ask them, what do you do about motivation? How do you get your staff, how do you get them to feel motivated about both productivity and quality at the same time? And one interesting sort of innovative way that I've seen actually took place is taking place currently at a very large technology firm, the name of which I cannot use, which is using our system for mass digitization. And because they're a private enterprise rather than a government agency or a school or institution, nonprofit, because they're a for-profit commercial entity, they have no problem giving people a base salary, which is then supplemented by bonuses based on both productivity, meaning total output, and quality. And it's all on a sliding scale, multi-tiered scale. If they can put out a nearly perfect product and put out a whole bunch of it, they get paid more. I'm not necessarily obviously saying that that's the only way to motivate, just pointing that out as one thing that one institution or one entity did to address the issue of motivation. Anything it doesn't have to be money. If you put up just putting up a target board to say what our target is and how close are we to achieving it is a form of motivation. Likewise, monotony. As a company, Digital Transitions has pushed very hard to improve the features in our software and hardware to reduce monotony, because we know that nobody wants to walk in on Monday morning and say, for instance, oh, I'm really glad that I have 500 images to manually crop by hand. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody feels that's an engaging process. So we worked really hard on the auto crop routine and capturing cultural heritage with the intention not only of increasing productivity, but of eliminating part of the job that is required but incredibly monotonous. Likewise, repetition versus variety. Can we maybe switch operators out? If we have 3 different stations doing 3 different things, can we have each person work a third of a shift on each, or work 1 day on each, or work 1 week on each, or 1 project on each? Is there a way that we can break up the repetition element and introduce some variety? Other side of that coin is distractions. Can we eliminate the things that would distract our operators? Can we play some light music so that noises don't distract them as much? Can we maybe segment out and say, don't worry about your emails. Nobody's going to expect you to check them while you're doing a project. So you do 3 hours of digitization, then check your email. Don't do 10 minutes of digitization, send 1 email, 10 minutes of digitization, send 1 email, because that is, again, breaking up the process and introducing distraction. And finally, we as a company have spent a lot of time working on ergonomics. We want to make sure that the systems that we produce are physically comfortable to use, because people will be doing it a lot and for very long periods of time. If we've identified the sources of variability and we acknowledge variability always exists, what can we do about monitoring it? And what we do is we include some form of target, and we either visually or numerically, that is either with a visual analysis or software analysis, take a look at that target to see how it's doing. Let's talk about the targets first. There's 2 main strategies for targets. using a device-level target before and after some session of shooting. That might be before and after every single shot, but more commonly before and after a series of shots, whether it's an entire book or several books or just every 100 pages of loose material, but some period of time we'd introduce a device-level target before and after. Or we can include an object-level target alongside the subject in every single shot. I want to show you real quick in Capture One example, just how this looks in case you've never done it or seen it, of what it looks like to have a book. So this is a 600-page book, and at the very beginning of this, we have an LCC reference, which is just a white piece of board in order to map out how the illumination is falling, followed by a target. Then at the very end of the book, so we go into the book and we have the first page of the book, the cover, the first page. At the very end of the book, we repeat that target, same physical situation, and the assumption is that if the target looks the same before and after, if it reads the same or visually appears the same before and after, that in all likelihood, we've had consistent, accurate results. That is, it's unlikely that the system varied in a way and then varied back the same amount. It didn't get 10% brighter and then 10% darker such that it ended up in the same place. It's not impossible for that to happen, but the working assumption is consistent at the beginning to the end means that in between was pretty good. If you do include an object-level target in every single shot, that gives you a much more definitive statement that every single one of those shots was consistent and accurate. So how do we analyze these targets? Well, you can do visual, and I want to show you one way of doing a visual analysis in Capture One that not everyone is aware of. In Capture One, you can bring up something called an overlay, and the overlay can put into the image an overlay, right? In another file that has transparency or doesn't have transparency, which you can then float over the raw data to see how it matches up. So you see what I'm moving right now is an idealized version of the color checker SG. That is, every single patch is exactly the numerical value that color checker SG should be in this color space. So these are the quote-unquote right values. And we'll talk a little bit later about measuring your chart, but let's just assume that this chart that I physically shot should have these exact values. When I physically overlay them in Capture One, I get the benefit of human intelligence, get the benefit of intuitive, easy, fast human interpretation in that I can just see, clickety-split, which of these colors are off. Now, I can't quantify that. I can't give you an exact number, but I can kind of say, all right, well, the greens all look okay, but the yellows are a little bit off, or the browns are a little off. The blues look good, but the reds are off, or whatever. In this specific case, by the way, I picked out a raw file where I knew the lighting would be wrong, where I knew the overall color response was not going to be good, because if I showed this example to you on one of our normal color checkers, you wouldn't see any of the dots on the inside, so the purpose of the demonstration would be kind of be defeated. But in here, you can see in this imperfect example, you can see the yellows and the greens are off here. Visual assessment, though, has some downsides. It's not very good at detecting slow drift. It's actually quite bad at that. So we have the cute picture of the frog, right, who jumps into the water, and then you turn the heater on, and because the temperature is changing slowly, he doesn't notice the water begins to boil. Well, the same thing can happen if you have changes in your process that are happening slowly. Maybe you have an open window nearby, and during the summer, the angle of the light through that window doesn't bother the digitization process, but as you come into fall, the angle of the light just slowly creeps over until it's changing your image more and more and more. You may not notice that because between Monday and Tuesday, there was almost no change. It just accumulated over the course of months. Visual assessment is going to miss things like that. Visual assessment is also really bad at absolute correctness. Our eyes have our vision system has all sorts of weird adaptive things it does that lie to us, that help us survive as human beings, but do not help us as technicians at a digital that do not help us as agents at a digitization center to identify absolute correct tone or color. So as an example of this, I'm sure you've all seen this particular optical illusion, but it gets me every time because even when you know that A and B are exactly the same tone, the patch here and the patch here are exactly the same tone, you still can't see it with your eye because it looks like B is brighter than A no matter what you do. And then also visual reference is not so great for detecting really small differences. So between the left and the right image here, there is a difference, but you'd be pretty hard pressed to identify it. And often when you see something that's that subtly different, you have to sort of go back and forth with your eyes. Am I just seeing things? Am I imagining it? So it's really hard to make really small discrimination. So visual assessment is good at not being blind to the environment. That's its one real strong suit. So we recall the image we looked at earlier. If I'm standing in that room as the operator and I see the brown walls, I don't need anyone to tell me that that's going to affect the image. I'm not blind to that environment. I know the context. I have human intelligence. So visual monitoring with that sort of human intelligence behind it can pick up on environmental factors and mitigating circumstances that a target reading software has no idea about. When we run this particular image through a target analysis software, all it can tell us is it's wrong and you should quote unquote fix it. And if we use any form of automatic fixing from it, if we employ any sort of script that looks for the blacks and makes them correct based on the target or so, what we'll find is a negative outcome from that. So in contrast, if we monitor via software, we will be very good at detecting slow drift, right? The computer has an infinite attention span. It doesn't matter if the change has been very slow or very sudden. It's just numbers to the computer. Likewise, it's excellent at being absolutely correct. That is, it's not going to be distracted by the sorts of optical illusions and visual analysis things that human beings are tricked by. It shows patch B as being 50.42. It shows patch A as being 50.42. It shows them as identical. And it's excellent at noticing small differences. So here where visually it was actually pretty hard to see which one was brighter, it's actually very, very straightforward to see that this one is 97 and this one's 94.5. It's actually a very big difference numerically, even though it's a very subtle visual difference. So it's very easy to pick up on those differences. So what software can we use then to make these numerical or software-based analyses? We've got Golden Thread, Capture 1CH, we've got Photoshop, and a website called Delt.ae. So that's software running as a website, software as a service. So let's take a look at the pros and cons of each of these, because they all have their place, and we see these used by our institutions, each and every one of them. So the first major advantage of Capture One Cultural Heritage is that it is in the raw workflow. That is, if you're going through start to finish a digitization project and you want to, on the 13th object, check where you are regarding your lab values or check where you are regarding your color accuracy, you don't have to leave the software to do it. You can use the image as raw in the raw workflow and analyze it therein. You don't have to then process it out and break the workflow to make the check. All four of these tools have PPI analysis and lab analysis. PPI being very important if you want to set a very specific PPI and match it every time. And lab, of course, since the targets we're using are typically self-described in lab. If you have a target where you have RGB values that you're using, that's okay, but RGB is always tied to a specific device and profile space. We want to use lab, generally speaking, because that is device independent, and it is a much more sort of scientific way of approaching color and tonal accuracy. So then, what are the advantages of Golden Thread and Delt.ae? The big advantage of those softwares are that they provide a more robust and complete set of cultural heritage analysis metrics than does Capture One Cultural Heritage or Photoshop. For instance, Golden Thread will provide you analysis of sampling efficiency, basically how sharp is the image and where is it sharp and is that sharpness changing across the frame or changing between images. Same thing with Delt.ae. They're going to give you things like delta E values that are more than simply analyzing the number and seeing that it's wrong. They'll give it to you in a sort of more quantitative, robust way. So these are things that are not currently available in Capture One Cultural Heritage, are not available in Photoshop, and allow you to do a more robust evaluation of the image. On the other side of the coin, though, both Capture One Cultural Heritage and Photoshop do allow you to really do robust visual checking. That is, they've got really great systems to navigate into and out of the image and between images, allow you to zoom into the image, allow you to overlay an idealized chart in the case of both Capture One Cultural Heritage and Photoshop. And while Golden Thread and Delt.ae have some rudimentary visual checking capacities, they're definitely software that's geared for numeric and computer-driven analysis rather than human visual analysis. So those are pros and cons there. Then finally, what's the difference between golden thread and delta AE? There's a few differences. One that we didn't put on this chart is just that golden thread is, in our opinion, more robustly developed regarding the math. It, for instance, takes into account knowledge about the physical way in which the target is constructed when it's doing analysis about sharpness, that the lines on a target can never be 100% sharp because there's always going to be some spread of the laser, the ink, or whatever material you're using to make that line. There's going to be a slight diffusion or softening at the edge of that line. Golden thread takes into account that diffusion to know what the maximum amount of sharpness you'd expect to see on a line on the target is. That's sort of nuanced but adds up to big things kind of math. Golden thread does very well. But the other biggie is that golden thread is under active development. Just this year, 2015, they released a new version that supports now film scanning targets, which is a big deal because we're seeing a lot more active film processing, active film digitization. They now support a barcode reading system wherein the targets that golden thread sends out are barcoded before they are sent out, and the true value of each target specific to that target is measured and encoded into that barcode. So when you stick a target into the scene, you analyze it in the golden thread software, it knows exactly what it's looking at. So very robust continuing development. Delta.AE was last updated in the middle of 2012, and there's no signs that that will be robustly developed and actively developed from here. So there's one more thing software can do that's kind of interesting. We love this chart. This is the chart that Don Williams uses in some of his presentations, and he was generous enough to provide to us, Don Williams of Image Science Associates. It shows hourly reports, hourly feedback on the scan. Sorry, let me start over again. This shows the tonality and consistency and accuracy of different patches on the target on many different scans across time. So what we see here is that there's sort of a corridor denoted by the red lines. This is what Don Williams refers to as a corridor of quality, meaning that, again, we expect and know variation will be there. We know variation will happen, but we want that variation to happen within these two red lines, or in this case, between these two red lines. And what we see is that we're pretty darn consistent, and then the floor drops out. So what happened here? Well, I think the more interesting story here is that they were able to find out what was going on there, right? The long-term monitoring of the software, the ability to extract this by the object level targets, provided the facility to ask the question, what happened? And when they asked that question, what they found was the dates and times of these drops. This was related to a 3-day weekend. There was a 3-day weekend, the operator came back, maybe they had a very good weekend, maybe they were a little bit tired, and they made a few mistakes in the setup. There was some user error involved in the setup, which then caused a drop in the accuracy beyond the corridor of quality, beyond the corridor of acceptable variation. So enabling software in your workflow, enabling this sort of data gathering by including targets and by having software that can analyze them, and then by following that up, by actually doing it, by actually analyzing that data, can lead you to answer questions you didn't know to ask in the first place. So we've talked about the sources of variation. We acknowledge that it exists. We talked about how we're going to monitor it. So now what do we do? And there's a lot of people on this call, and we've looked at the institution list, and we've worked with a lot of you guys before, and we know there's going to be a lot of variation in where you guys are in your journey towards implementing really robust process control setups. So what I want to emphasize now, and if you're one of the institutions that has a very robust program already in place, you're already using targets, you already measure your own targets, if you're already one of those institutions, you can sort of zone out for a minute. I want to talk specifically to those that aren't at that place yet, that don't use targets or use, say, outdated or legacy targets or aren't measuring them. I want to talk to you right now. Don't feel overwhelmed. The most important thing you can do, and the simplest thing you can do, is to enable yourself to, in the future, know where you are. That is to say, start using targets. You don't necessarily even have to, day one, start analyzing the targets. You don't have to, day one, make decisions based on those targets. But if you don't include targets, then you don't know where you are. And it's much better to be a little bit wrong, say a little bit inaccurate or a little bit imprecise and know it, than it is to be inaccurate or imprecise and not know it. So first and foremost, enable yourself to know where you are. Use targets. Next, when you have time, when you have resources, find out where you are. Analyze those targets. Find out where you stand in the terms of accuracy and consistency, both within specific collections, between operators, between stations, between equipment. Find out where you are. Again, take things one step at a time. You don't have to make decisions yet. Just find out where you are. Then, when you have time and resources, decide where you need to be, right? There shouldn't be a knee-jerk reaction. If you start collecting data, and this is an unfortunate tale, we see a lot of institutions, we come in and they're using legacy scanners, planetary scanners, desktop scanners, whatever, and they're not performing where they think they are, and they start using targets, they start analyzing, and they find out, oh, we're actually not getting the quality we want, so they just knee-jerk react and do something. And that's not normally the right course of action. You need to first decide, where do you want to be? Where do you need to get to? What level of quality is important for your institution? This is something we write a lot about in the digitization program planning guide that Pete referenced at the beginning, that we'll be releasing for free on our website, 50 pages, 25 institutions. It's a pretty big, dense guide, and a lot of what we focus on is helping you make the decision of where you need to be with quality. We're very, of course, at Digital Transition Division of Cultural Heritage, we are advocates for high quality. We would love every institution on every project to use maximum quality every single time, but we realize it's not always realistic, and frankly, it's not always necessary. If you are scanning things for content extraction only, if all you're trying to do is be able to legibly identify words on a page, you don't necessarily need FADGI 4-star quality as an example of a guideline you might implement. You might only need FADGI 3-star quality. But the important thing is to decide where you need to be. So once you've figured out where you are and where you need to be, then you can make a plan for how to get there. And we'll make we'll offer up to you guys at any institution, whether you're using our system or not. We're glad to help with this. We're glad to help you identify where you are. We're glad to help identify where you need to be. We're glad to help you make a plan for how to get there. We feel very passionately about cultural heritage. We feel very passionately about creating good preservation practices so that all the effort that we see day to day, we come into a place and we see the people working very hard, we want to make sure that the quality and the results of that work are the proper reward for their hard work. We've now given a whole presentation for whatever it's been, an hour, on following rules and on how to follow those rules prescriptively. And what we want to acknowledge now at the end of this is that we understand and endorse and are enthusiastic about the fact that digitization is more than manufacturing. It is more than simply a scientific process. That there is an art as well as a science to it. That sometimes breaking rules is not only important, it's essential. That you can create a bad end product by simply following the rules and making sure that the target looks good. The target is the target, and it's an important reference point, but you are imaging collections, not targets. And so in the next webinar, we'll talk about some more creative digitization techniques, things like raking light and illumination angles, which Pete touched on, and we'll touch on those things that break the rules and which require the rules to be thrown away.
Well, that's great, Doug. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Allison if anyone posted a question.
Pete, maybe we'd like to speak about targets and measuring them, because we didn't actually include that in this. So I'll ask you the question, Pete. Pete, how do we deal with the fact that targets themselves are not absolutely right? That in fact, based on the premise of this webinar, that everything varies, that every single target is in fact wrong. It's only a question of how wrong is it? How close to being right is it? Not is it right, because it's never right. It's how close is it? How do you deal with that, Pete?
I mean, I think ultimately you're dealing with a moving target. The target it's organic, so it's constantly shifting over time. And really, the only way to really manage this, if you really want to get down to it, is getting a spectrophotometer and constantly monitor your target and make sure that the process controls are very tight. And it's kind of the same thing with the camera as well. One of the things that you'll start to notice as you really want to tighten down the ratchet, so to say, if you're interested in FADGI 4-star or Metamorphose Extreme, for lack of a better word, you have to treat your camera like a spectrophotometer, meaning that you have to light your object with the target in scene very, very carefully. Otherwise, things go awry. But back to targets. I mean, targets need to be updated regularly. We tend to recommend swapping out targets every 6 months or so. The newer targets from Image Science Associates are individually serialized, where they have their unique, what they call target data file, which is an exact measurement of each swatch as well.
Which is actually encoded and identified via a barcode, so it can be automatically done by the software.
So it's actually a pretty nice feature for the target. And there were some other questions about the difference between Capture One, CH8, and the regular versions of Capture One. The processing engines on both pieces of software are pretty similar. Capture One Cultural Heritage has some more advanced core processes for just dealing with film. It also comes with unique profiles for digitizing works of art that render very accurate reproductions, auto cropping tools, and so forth.
As well as lab evaluation, which comes in handy when you're evaluating targets that are in fact encoded or self-described in lab values.
Yeah, that's true. And actually, lab there's not just one version of lab. There's a few versions of that, where there are various transforms for lab, whether it's Van Crease or the Bradford transform. Adobe has its own. Adobe products have their own mechanism for evaluating lab. They assume that everything's going to go out to press, so there's no absolute black. So they impose a gamma curve correction on it, which is not very scientific. So what Phase 1 decided to do was give you a variety of common flavors of lab implementations, which Doug is now showing on his screen right now.
Very good. Allison, if we've not had any additional questions, I think we will probably wrap it up there.
There was actually, hold on, there was one.
Oh,
what type of, actually there are two now. What type of target do you recommend for 3D object photography is the first question.
Personally, I mostly recommend a white balance target for 3D objects, because once you start having descriptive lighting, it's very hard to characterize a camera based on that. So personally, I'd be much more interested in a target that renders accurate tone and neutrality. That's just my personal opinion.
And I would only add to that in 3D descriptive lighting, it is much less obvious where you should be targeting white if in fact you're lighting from the side or from behind. And that is going to be one of the key elements of our upcoming webinar on creative lighting, because in fact, when you're talking about three-dimensional objects, unless you're going to treat it like a 45-degree angles from each side and that's it, then you definitely, if you're adding any form of creativity in that lighting to help accentuate the features of that object that you want to bring out or make more prominent, you're not going to be able to use just a standard, say, golden thread target facing forward and expect that to be fully informative about what the correct answer for the lighting or the exposure is. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to include a golden thread target, but it's certainly much less prescriptive in that case. You certainly can't use the target in that case to say, I will absolutely positively do X because of patch 10 or patch 7 or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's been some theoretical targets on the market that kind of shaped like disco balls that are also supposed to help derive some documentation about the lighting as well. But I think that's still one of those areas that's more theoretical than practical at the moment.
What was the second question, Allison?
Okay, so the second question is that the client has said that they have a very precise workflow, but we're faced with a challenge moving to Capture One 8 from our established workflow in Capture One 6. With the changes in pixel accuracy, color renders out differently in 8. Do you have any suggestions for managing change and maintaining precision across versions?
Absolutely. This is a great question, and it's an example of where there is no, I think, right answer to this question, but I can certainly point out a couple features and capabilities that can make your life a little easier here. One is that you can absolutely continue forward with the Capture One 6 engine. So as regards the quality and the pixel rendering and the way that the detail is rendered, if I choose under Capture One Preferences Image, that's Capture One Preferences Image, I can select Default Processing Engine, and I can select the version 6 engine. So even though I'm running Capture One 8, the software, the engine or the math and algorithms will be the Capture One 6 math. Now, that will keep me consistent to what I was before, but in my opinion and experience, that will mean lowered accuracy. So we did mention this at the beginning. It is absolutely a valid argument to say that if we have to choose between accuracy and precision, there is an argument that we should be precise but inaccurate. That said, whether or not it's the right choice to continue forward with Capture 1.6 processing, knowing that it is less accurate in order to keep precision, is a decision only you can make with your institution and knowing what your priorities are. In abstraction, I would say upgrade to version 8. It's just better. But from the point of view of precision, I don't know what your workflows are. I don't know if you're putting together catalogs of artwork, for instance, over the last 3 years for one catalog. Well, then in that case, precision is much more important than accuracy. You want it to be the same as it was before. Hopefully that answers that person's question, but that is the main, I think, facility by which you'd be able to move forward with version 8 software, but use the version 6 processing engine. Yeah, likewise, by the way, I should point out one more thing, Pete, that is, you know, we've made vastly improved cultural heritage color profiles for all of our digital backs in Capture 1.8 cultural heritage. And they are, with no question in my mind, more accurate for color rendering. But we have not thrown away the old profiles. The old profiles are still there. So again, if you're working on a project wherein you're trying to deliver a cohesive product and you're now using Capture 1 Cultural Heritage 8, you do not need to go to the new profiles. You don't need to. It's simply an option provided to you to use those new, more accurate profiles. If you want to continue to use the existing legacy profiles, that will help you to be more precise to your older work, even if it is less accurate. Those were great questions. Did you have something to say, Pete?
I was just thinking that's a little bit off topic, but that's why some institutions decide to keep their raw file, because if you use the present demosaicing engine, it's actually much better than version 1, obviously. So if you kind of kept all your raw files, you can kind of reprocess your materials, and you will have both, as Doug was indicating before, accuracy and precision.
So again, of course, not knowing the institution and knowing the whole story behind it, if you do still have your raws from the first half of a project, say, again, I'm speculating on what your exact details are, but if you had half of a project done in Capture 1.6, but you still have those raws, then your options are either to make Capture 1.8 behave as Capture 1.6, or use Capture 1.8 and actually go back and reprocess those images that were in Capture 1.6 processing. And you can do that just by going back to that raw file and push upgrade, and voila, we're now using Capture 1.8's processing. In fact, even in this specific example, you saw the dust and the detail here being rendered much more cleanly, as well as this line off to the left. So keeping your raw files definitely opens up future processing improvements, which can help you improve both accuracy without breaking precision or consistency. Pete, shall we wrap up?
That's a good idea. So again, please send us your ideas about future webinars and so forth. This one, again, to note, was a kind of a first step building block on more advanced topics of lighting and imaging techniques, because we thought that process control offered a pretty nice base layer to build upon. Doug, thank you again for putting this together. You did a great job. And again, thank everyone for attending. Allison, you as well. Have a great afternoon, all.